The unlikeliest bride, the bet that changed everything. Abilene, Texas, 1883. A town where hope was as scarce as rain. Rose Harper, draped in the somber silhouette of her morning dress, stood on the porch of the town's boarding house. The wind stirred her skirts, a silent whisper in a world that felt deaf to her plight. She was unaware that just down the dusty road in the smoky haze of the local saloon, a man was wagering her future on the turn of a card. Jeb Callahan, a rancher with a face weathered by sun and stoicism, slammed his empty glass on the table. The words, uttered with a draw as dry as the prairie itself, echoed through the quiet chatter. "I'll marry the Harper widow for 50 acres and your new stallion, Matthews." The roar of laughter that followed was a cruel soundtrack to the bet, a bet no one believed he'd actually follow through on. The ink was barely dry on the marriage certificate 3 days later. Her acceptance a blend of desperation and defiant pride. But before we reveal the shocking truth about what happened on their first night at the Callahan Ranch, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you incredible, forgotten true stories from America's past that the history books leave out. Sheriff Grant Lawson watched the mismatched pair ride away, shaking his head at the most heartless wager he'd seen in his 2 decades on the force. The betting book at the saloon had Rose running back to town in tears within a month, with 10-1 odds against her. What none of them knew was that beneath Rose's quiet exterior beat the heart of a survivor. Her husband's gambling had left her not only in debt, but a pariah in a town that had once welcomed her. And as the Callahan Ranch appeared on the horizon, a lone 2-story house standing against the vast Texas sky, Rose's mind was already racing. The bet had begun, but so had her plan to transform from a cruel wager into Jeb Callahan's greatest shock. The whole thing started, as it often did in Abilene, with too much whiskey and not enough sense. Jeb Callahan was on his 3rd glass when Luther Matthews began running his mouth about the fat widow Harper. He claimed no man would have her, not even with the small inheritance she had. 50 acres and your new stallion says I'll marry her by week's end. Jeb had growled, his words cutting through the smoke. It wasn't about kindness or even desire. It was about pride. Jeb Callahan had never lost a bet in his life. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, women were whispering behind their gloved hands. As Rose went to the general store, completely unaware that her future had been decided over whiskey and cards. Sheriff Lawson cornered Jeb outside the barber shop. His face was a mask of disapproval. "You're gambling with a woman's life, Callahan. That's no different than gambling with a man's last dollar when he's desperate," he warned, his hand resting on his holster. Jeb simply adjusted his hat. "A bet's a bet, Sheriff. Besides, she'll have a roof over her head and food, more than most widows get out here." His voice was as flat as if he were discussing the purchase of a new plow. Rose received his proposal on her boarding house porch. Her eyes gave away that she knew the true motive behind his sudden interest. "I know about the bet, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice steady. "I'll accept on one condition. You never speak of how this marriage came to be." The minister looked uncomfortable as he joined their hands. No one offered congratulations. Rose's younger sister, Nellie, pressed a small bundle into her hands before she boarded Jeb's wagon. "Don't let him break you," she whispered fiercely. "You write if you need me." Quote. Luther Matthews and the men from the saloon watched them go. 50 acres for taken. In the fat widow, Callahan got himself robbed, Matthews yelled, his cruel laughter carrying on the wind, but none of them noticed the grim determination on Rose's face. She had survived her late husband's drinking and debt. She had survived the loneliness of widowhood and the town's scorn. She would survive whatever waited for her at Callahan Ranch. The sheriff watched the wagon until it was a speck in the heat haze. He'd seen the look in Rose's eyes, not defeat but quiet calculation. "God help you, Callahan," he murmured. "You've no idea what you just brought home." The journey to the ranch passed in silence, with miles stretching between them like an uncrossable chasm. As the 2-story house appeared on the horizon, Rose straightened her back, preparing for battle. Not just for survival, but for respect, something she had never truly known. The ranch house loomed against the setting sun, a testament to permanence, not comfort. Rose noted the lack of curtains, the absence of any garden. Jeb led her inside without ceremony. "Your room's at the end of the hall. I eat breakfast at dawn, dinner at sundown. The rest is up to you," he said flatly, as if reading a contract. The interior reflected the same stark functionality. The furniture was solid, the walls bare. That first night, Rose sat alone at the kitchen table assessing her new domain. The pantry was bare, the stove poorly maintained, and the water pump squeaked with neglect. Morning arrived with the crow of a rooster and the sound of Jeb's heavy boots leaving for the barn without a word. Rose quickly dressed, determined to establish her place before the sun was fully up. The kitchen was her first battlefield. She scrubbed years of grease from every surface until her hands were raw. By the time Jeb returned for breakfast, a spread of biscuits, bacon, and eggs awaited him. He ate without comment, but the slight widening of his eyes and the clean plate he left behind were all the approval she needed. The ranch hands eyed her wearily when she appeared at the barn with a lunch basket. The oldest hand, a leathery man named Hank, finally acknowledged her with a tip of his hat, Mrs. Callahan. The title felt strange, a reminder of the hasty transaction that had brought her here. By the end of the first week, Rose had mentally mapped every inch of the house. The place was solid but neglected, much like the man who owned it. In the quiet of her room, she wrote to her sister Nellie, careful not to reveal the loneliness. The ranch is bigger than I expected. Mr. Callahan keeps to himself, which suits me fine. I have plans for this place that would surprise them all. The second Sunday, she put on her best dress and waited by the wagon. Bible in hand, town's 15 miles, Jeb said gruffly. Church ain't part of our arrangement. Rose simply climbed onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and left him with a choice. Join her or watch her drive away alone. Heads turned as Rose entered the small white church. She walked down the aisle, chin held high despite the whispers. Jeb had chosen to stay home. The sermon pointedly focused on the sanctity of marriage with Reverend Phillips, glancing meaningfully in her direction. After the service, the women of the congregation gathered on the steps, their conversation faltering as Rose approached. Mrs. Matthews, Luther's wife, made a point of gathering her skirts as if to prevent them from brushing against Rose's dress. Nellie, however, broke away from the group. "You look well, Mrs. Callahan," she said loud enough for others to hear. The general store was no respite. Conversations halted as she entered. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, took her list with pursed lips, his gaze flicking to her wedding band. "We're having a meeting of the ladies' auxiliary on Thursday," Mrs. Peterson said with a brittle smile as Mrs. Callahan, "You'd be eligible to attend." The invitation was a challenge. Sheriff Lawson intercepted her as she loaded her wagon. "How are things out at the ranch?" he asked quietly. "Jeb can be a hard man." Rose gave him a small smile. "Mr. Callahan and I have an understanding, Sheriff. I'm exactly where I choose to be." The words were for more ears than just his. That Thursday, Rose arrived for the ladies' auxiliary meeting to find it had been postponed without notice. Through the lace curtains of Mrs. Peterson's parlor, she could see the women inside. Their teacups paused in midair as they spotted her on the porch. Nellie found her sister later. "They're saying horrible things, Rose. That Jeb only married you because no one else would." "Let them talk," Rose replied, sorting through fabric remnants for new curtains. "What matters isn't what Abilene thinks of me now, but what they'll think when I'm done." Quote, "The ride back to the ranch was long, but Rose's mind was racing. The town had shown its true face, but she hadn't survived widowhood and poverty by wilting in the face of hardship. And she wouldn't start now. The north pasture of the Callahan Ranch had been abandoned for 2 seasons. Jeb had written it off. Rose discovered the neglected land during her 3rd week, and the soil, dry but not dead, reminded her of her childhood farm. That evening, she approached Jeb as he sat on the porch. "The north pasture could be salvaged," she stated. "My father used clover to fix nitrogen in soil." Just like that, Jeb's eyebrows rose. "Your father taught you about farming." "My father had no sons," she replied simply. "He taught me everything he knew." The next morning, she found a small plot in the north pasture marked off with a bag of clover seed on the porch. No words were exchanged, but the silent permission spoke volumes. Working the soil brought a flush to Rose's cheeks and strength to her arms. She sang old folk songs, her voice carrying across the land. Hank, the old ranch hand, started watching her work. "My grandmother used to plant by the moon cycles," he offered one day, said it made the difference between scraping by and abundance. Word of Rose's experiment reached town playing at being a farmer now. Luther Matthews sneered. "Bet that fat wife of yours gives up before the first sprouts show." The mockery died on his lips when Jeb's hand shot out, gripping his collar. "Mrs. Callahan's name doesn't belong in your mouth, Matthews. Keep it that way." By the 6th week, green shoots had broken through the soil. Rose stood at the edge of her small victory, unaware that Jeb was watching from a distance, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving her. The ranch hands began to seek her out, first with questions about farming, then with requests for remedies for injuries or advice. The boss's bet had become a woman of value. The late summer brought a brutal drought. Jeb found her standing by the dwindling creek, worry lines etched on his face. "Last time it was this dry, we lost half the herd," he said, speaking directly to her for the first time. Rose stepped beside him. "My father dug catchment basins above natural depressions, saved our crops in '74. That evening, a small wooden box sat on the kitchen table. Inside was a silver locket with a portrait of a young woman and a small boy. My sister and her son. Jeb confirmed later typhoid took them both while I was away. Nothing to come home to but this land." The admission of his grief mirrored her own. Days of backbreaking work followed as everyone on the ranch followed Rose's water conservation ideas. The drought intensified. Jeb spent longer hours in the fields, the weight of potential failure pressing down on him. One evening she found him at the kitchen table, his father's ledger open to columns of desperate numbers. Without a word, she sat opposite him. "We could sell the east section." She suggested it's the least productive land, and the Petersons want to expand. It would see us through until the rains come. Jeb looked up, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as the subject of a cruel bet, but as a partner. "Your husband left you with nothing but debts, didn't he?" he asked. Rose nodded. "Yes," she answered. "But I survived, and so will this ranch." The east section had barely been listed when disaster struck. A traveler's smoldering campfire erupted into a wildfire that raced toward them on the hot wind. Jeb shouted for the hands, his face grim. "Get to town, Rose. Take what you can and go," he ordered. But Rose had no intention of leaving. She raced to the root cellar, emerging with jars of preserved fruit. She smashed them around the house's perimeter. "The sugar will burn hot but contained," she explained to a bewildered hand. "It'll create a barrier." When the wind shifted, trapping two young ranch hands near the barn, it was Rose who spotted their danger. Without hesitation, she mounted Jeb's prized stallion and rode directly toward the approaching flames. The men watched in disbelief as the woman they had once dismissed navigated through blinding smoke and searing heat to lead the stranded hands to safety. By nightfall, the fire had been turned away from the main buildings. Exhausted and sporting a burn on her forearm, Rose continued to work alongside the men, tending to their minor injuries. In the gray light of dawn, Jeb found her asleep on the porch steps. For a long moment he simply stood watching her, his expression transforming from weariness into something deeper. A revelation was dawning in his eyes that would change everything. The aftermath brought a strange quiet to the ranch. The house, barn, and the precious green shoots in the north pasture were all intact. News of Rose's daring rescue spread through Abilene. "Sheriff Lawson rode out personally. Never seen anything like it," Hank told a crowd later at Dusty Saloon. Even Luther Matthews fell silent. His mockery dried up in the face of such courage. The ladies' auxiliary, led by Mrs. Peterson, arrived with wagons of food and offers of assistance. Their earlier rejection of Rose was carefully unmentioned, replaced by ossive praise. Rose accepted their help with quiet dignity. "The Lord teaches us to help our neighbors in need," she said simply, serving coffee to the very women who had snubbed her weeks before. Jeb watched this transformation with quiet amazement. One evening, Sheriff Lawson caught Jeb alone. "You know, Callahan, a bet's just words until it's paid. But a marriage is supposed to be more than a transaction." The simple truth of the sheriff's words stayed with Jeb. That night he found himself standing outside Rose's bedroom door, his hand raised to knock. Inside her room, Rose stood before the mirror examining the healing burn on her arm. The frightened widow had been burned away, revealing a woman of unexpected strength. When Jeb finally knocked, the conversation that followed lasted until dawn. Honest words about mistakes and regrets, and about the surprising way fate works. The harvest dance, the social event of the season, brought families together. Rose received an invitation with surprise. "We should attend," Jeb suggested over breakfast. "Show them the Callahan Ranch didn't just survive, it's thriving." The unspoken acknowledgement that they would face the town as true partners hung between them. Rose spent a week altering one of her simple dresses, turning it into something elegant. The town fell silent when the Callahans entered the barn. Gone was the reluctant bride and her cold husband. They were replaced by a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, and a man whose protective stance at her side spoke volumes. Luther Matthews approached them hat in hand. "Mrs. Callahan, I owe you an apology," he stammered. "And you too, Jeb, that bet. It was wrong." Rose accepted his apology with grace. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Matthews," she said. "It's what we learn from them that matters." Nellie Harper, now engaged to a young man from San Antonio, caused another stir. She pressed a sealed envelope into Rose's hands. It was a letter from their father's former business partner, long thought to have absconded with their family's funds. "He's repaid everything," Rose explained to a stunned Jeb. With this unexpected windfall, she could have left. Instead, as the band struck up a waltz, she took Jeb's hand and led him to the dance floor, making her choice clear. A choice not based on necessity, but on the love that had grown, where only scorn and betting odds had existed before. 1 year to the day after the infamous bet, Jeb stood on his front porch watching the sunrise. The north pasture flourished, the barn was rebuilt, and the once bare house now reflected the warmth of the woman who had made it a home. Inside, Rose was preparing for their anniversary celebration, not of their wedding day, but of the fire that had burned away pretense and revealed what lay beneath. The women from town would arrive later. Sheriff Lawson would come, bearing news that the Callahan Ranch had been nominated for an agricultural award. Luther Matthews would attend, humbled. As Rose stepped onto the porch and slipped her hand into Jeb's, they surveyed their kingdom, not with the eyes of a man who had accepted a bet, or a woman who had accepted degradation, but as true partners. They had found in each other the most unexpected prize of all, a love that had been forged in fire, strengthened through adversity, and would continue to flourish like the Texas wildflowers that now bloomed where once there had been only dust. If Rose's journey from a cruel bet to unexpected love touched your heart, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit subscribe now to join our community of storytelling lovers. Like this video to help others discover it. Leave a comment sharing which moment moved you most, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true strength often hides where others least expect it. Because some stories, like the love that bloomed at Callahan Ranch, are simply too powerful to experience alone.